Recording in progress.
Welcome back to another edition of Coaching with the Bible. This is episode 163, season 4, episode 3. A topic this week on how to fight. Not a topic we normally discuss, not something that is normally something that we coach in Coaching with the Bible when we're talking about how to be a great leader and how to improve the lot and the situation of your team, of your family, of yourself. We don't talk about fighting in the manner in which we're going to talk about fighting today. This week's portion is the portion known as Lech Lecha. It is the third portion in the book of Genesis. It is the fourth time we're discussing it. Let's dive in on how to fight. We begin today with a quote. It's a quote from Winston Churchill. The quote was said in his first speech as Prime Minister in May of 1940. And he said as follows: "You ask, what is our policy? I will say it is to wage war with all our might, with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and however hard the road may be, for without victory, there is no survival." It's an incredibly powerful quote. We know what followed in the years after the battle for the world, World War II. And so we come today to talk here in Coaching with the Bible about fighting. And typically speaking, when we're talking to our children and we're thinking about it for ourselves, we do not talk about fighting. Growing up in our house, I would say that fighting wasn't allowed, but there was definitely some fighting. 4 children, 3 older ones were brothers or boys. My sister is the youngest. I, as the youngest of those 3 boys, knew that in the event that there was a fight, I was going to lose. No questions asked. I was the youngest, I was the smallest. I had the most disadvantages in that space. And I remember a few moments in that house where we fought. But fighting overall was not a thing. And fighting in my house, here, we are blessed with children that do not really fight with each other, ever. It's a gift. It's appreciated. But the world is standing at a moment when a fight is coming. The fight has started. And so now the fighting back is commenced as well. And so the question for today is, how do we fight? How do we fight, specifically, how do we fight like the people of Israel? Or, at the moment, because a lot of people are saying it this way, how do you fight like a Jew? How do you fight like a Jew? For so many years, for our people, fighting was not something we could do. Since the days of the exile itself, when effectively fighting for the Jewish people ended, until relatively recently, that was not a thing. The vision of the Jew was the vision of someone who was weak, someone who could be scapegoated, someone who could be killed at will, someone who could be attacked, someone who could be beaten, someone who could be exiled, someone who could be mocked and made fun of, without any concern, really, that a Jew would fight back anywhere in the world. But that is no longer true. And the reality is that it hasn't been true for some time. And so the question you ask is, how do you fight? Because we fight. And it looks like we're about to get into a very big fight. One that we did not want, but one that was started, and now one that we have to finish. Victory at all costs, in the words of Churchill. And so the question is, how do we fight? How do we fight like a Jew? Because as I described, the image or the imagery that has been allowed to persist for generations about us as a people has been that of which we could be mocked and made fun of and scapegoated and stereotyped and mocked with nothing to do about it. And then kicked out from one country to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. Exile after exile after exile until no more. And so it would seem to some degree today that there's a significant portion of the world, I don't say that lightly, that would like to see that happen now. Whether they know it when they say it or they're the useless idiots of the day when they say it, they talk about from the river to the sea. And so in this moment, we fight. We fight on many battlefields, we fight on many levels, and we each fight in a way that we know how to fight. But we do fight. Victory at all costs. And so what I want to lay out for you today is sort of an understanding and an appreciation that the reality of how we fight and where we learn to fight comes from the Bible. It comes from our forefathers. It comes from our history. Because what is interesting to see in the Bible today, specifically this week, is the first warrior in the Bible, Abraham. And oh, he fights. He's not just some guy who sits at his tent and welcomes guests. He's not just some guy who went on a journey and ended up in the land of Canaan, which ended up being the land for his children and grandchildren, all the generations that would follow. He fights. He fights a war. A war he didn't start, a war he really had no part in, but a war nonetheless, and a war that he wins. See, the truth is about the Bible, and we know this, that there is a lot of fighting in the Bible. The book of Genesis is a lot of fighting between siblings. But beyond the fights between siblings, there's a lot of war. It's on some level, for a lot of people, I think, viewed as a bloody book. The 5 books of Moses, the books of the prophets, lots and lots of war, lots and lots of fighting. But Abraham fights that first war. And he fights that first war because his nephew, or as the Bible describes it, his brother, is taken captive, hostage. Because he's connected, related, attached to Abraham, even though they don't live together any longer. Even though they had separated sometime before, he is associated with Abraham. And by dint of that association, he is a target with the hope that it would draw Abraham into battle. And then who knows what happens next? It sounds familiar. Because it is familiar. It's not the first time now that this has happened. But the question then becomes, how do you fight? What do you do? How do you go about it? And Abraham sets to it. Abraham, then Isaac in a different way, and then Jacob thereafter, and Moses after them, in terms of how the battles are fought and how the battles are won. Because they each do fight. Even as Moses is ultimately a person of words, he is ultimately our great teacher, he's also one heck of a warrior in a variety of ways. Joshua, no less, following in the conquering of the land. Perhaps no one greater in our lore than David or Judah Maccabee and his siblings. Could you imagine for just a second what it would have been like for David to have an army like the one we have now? Or for Judah to be fighting with 300,000 reserves against the enemy that he fought at the time? Judah has no doubt that he'll be victorious because the size of the army isn't what's important, he said. 3rd chapter, book of Maccabees, 1. Can you imagine what that would be? What that would have been then? What that might have been over the course of centuries if we had the state, the nation, the place to be, the home, and the ability to defend it. But we didn't. But now we do. And so how do we fight? So Abraham, who has no interest, no desire to get into a war, gets into a war. And how does he fight? He draws together his students, the people who are in his household, the people who can appreciate the manner in which he thinks, the philosophy by which he lives, the way in which he acts in life, can appreciate distilling that, putting that into a space of war and going to war. Because first and foremost, Abraham fights for family, and he fights using his family to fight that war, united with his household. See, the mistake the people there made was because maybe they were separated, that Abraham might not come to fight, but the Bible describes it specifically as his brother is taken, even though they're not brothers. It's the same way people around here would talk. Everyone's achi, achi. Achi means my brother. No matter how distant, no matter how disconnected, one house, one family. So Abraham fights for family, and he uses the family as his army. Whether we understand it as simply just being his servant Eliezer, or the numbers of 318 that are listed is his student body, the people that he has brought close to God, who now are going to go fight, either way, that's the army. And he arms them. And the manner in which they fight is not simply to just sort of swat the flies and move people out of the neighborhood. No. Take a look at the Bible, the way the Bible describes it, how far and vast is the battle zone that Abraham takes, because victory at all costs. Ending the enemy and bringing home the captive. How far he goes to the west, how far to the north. He fights and battles these enemies, and they are enemies until victory. So Abraham fights for family. He fights for God, because we know that in the Midrashic literature and in our history, in our tradition, that Abraham spent years on the debate field as well, arguing for God, battling with people about faith and belief in God, to the point of being put to fire, burned potentially to death for the sake of fighting and standing for God, for his beliefs. So he fights for family, he fights for God, and he fights for home, he fights for country. Because this is the land that God had intended for him. God had promised to him and his descendants. And so he fights for it. And he fights on behalf of the armies of the people who live around him. And he fights for them. Victory at all costs. And he wins. But what's important to appreciate is the manner in which he fought was to no end in terms of seeking out the enemy and destroying the enemy. But he's not looking for spoils. This isn't about money. This is about God. This is about why. It's much bigger than any monetary victory he could get from this, or a prize. To have the nations of the world standing around him, looking at him as like he's a king, and have him then say, look, I don't want anything, simply pay the soldiers for what they did and appreciate God on high, because it is through God that we are victorious, that is more than enough for him. To soil that with money or any sort of cries doesn't work for Abraham. Doesn't work for Isaac. Doesn't work for Jacob when Jacob fights the angel. Jacob fights that battle to the end until that angel, quote unquote, cries uncle and blesses him and changes his name. Because Jacob fights a slightly different battle. Not for this week. But our forefather, the founder of our faith, is not only a person of great loving kindness and righteousness and goodness and morality, he is also a warrior. So a man of God can also be a man of war if necessary, because the Bible describes God as the God of war. And to get into all the sort of the philosophy about how that works and why it is that God creates people to be destroyed, that's beyond me. But in a world in which we require moral clarity and moral courage to stand it up and call it out for what it is, Abraham, our forefather. Isaac, our forefather. Jacob, our forefather. Moses, our great leader. And down the line, David, Judah. Clarity about what an enemy is and how you fight an enemy and what's needed in victory and how you fight it until ultimately you get there. And the reality of it is for all of us is that we fight that war in different ways. Each of us has our battlefield. Each of us has the war that we need to fight right now. But for a moment, take an appreciation of our soldiers, the men and women on the battlefield. Take pride in who they are and how they represent us. That is Jew, Christian, Muslim, Druze, take your pick. They represent the nation. They represent the good people of the world. And be proud. And when it is that your child comes to you and says they want to dress up on the holiday like an Israeli soldier, take pride in that. Because our soldiers stand straight up, spine, rock solid, ready to go to war, armed to the teeth, if necessary, to fight to the end for the sake of family, country, nation, faith. To go down to the bases to see the soldiers where they are, to be around them, the level of morale, the level of preparedness and readiness to fight the enemy, to vanquish and destroy the enemy so they can return to their normal lives, is unbelievable to see. You can see videos, soldiers dancing and singing, and they have this sort of power and energy that's with them that is palpable, but more than palpable, it's something to be incredibly proud of. Because as I said, this is not the old Jew that we remember. It's the older Jew, or what was described to me once as the new old Jew, bringing back the Abraham, David, and Judah of the world to our people. Because today we can fight for ourselves. Today we can stand up to an enemy, and we have multiple times, and we will again now. But for each of us, it's the domain in which we fight this battle, because this battle is being waged in many levels, in many ways, as it was back then. For some of us, the battle in which we're fighting is in the social media space. We're out there and we're arguing, we're debating, we're standing up for our people. For some of us, it's on college campuses. We're standing up to hate and to anti-Semitism and threat and danger simply because somebody is a Jew. Or maybe it's simply in the social space here within the land of Israel, within the community, and repairing the divides that have been building up, that have been tearing us apart even up to even 3.5 weeks ago. And that's your space and that's your domain. or it's in the space of helping people be prepared for what they need for the moment, in helping them get the goods that they need, to get the equipment that they need, to get the funds that they need to be able to do the things that they need to do for their country, their community, their people, their family, their army. We're waging that war on many levels. In not a single one of them is the response that we're giving and that we're bringing proportionate. Term of the day. When you storm the heavens with prayer, you just storm the heavens with disproportionate amount of prayer. When you storm the world with goodness, you storm the world with a disproportionate amount of goodness. See what's going on here with respect to community outreach and volunteerism and giving, philanthropy, shipping of goods, people bringing all kinds of things that people here need, the tons of items in terms of just simple weightage, disproportionate. And when victory or life is on the line, it's a disproportionate response, because that's what requires to get the victory that you need. And so how do we fight? We fight by understanding the why of the fight. We're understanding the what of the fight, understanding the how of the fight, and by supporting and promoting and pushing and being there for our people in its greatest time of need, and then propping it up and going forward until victory is achieved. In the same way that it's the case with David in the book of Samuel. In the same way that David describes war and victory in the Psalms. In the same way that Judah writes about it, or it's written about him and of what he had said at the time in the space in the book of Maccabees. And then the lore that surrounds the holiday of Hanukkah. The large, the many in the hands of the small. The new old Jew has returned. And the power that that new old Jew brings to the world, and the goodness and the moral clarity and courage that it brings, is something that is sorely needed, because it is incredibly lacking. And we've been thrust into that space. To get to the greatest victories, we must fight the greatest battles. And it's certainly true, as it's said in a lot of domains and in a lot of spaces, we didn't get here to this point just to get here to this point. There's so much more that we want to bring into the world. There's so much more that we want to do. There's so much more that we want to accomplish that's good for the world. That's so far beyond anything of war and battle. But the moment requires the battle. The moment requires the war. And we need to be strong. And we need to be proud. Because those of us who are not on a battlefield, who are bringing that morale, who are bringing that energy to those people, who are bringing that support, who have the faith, who have the belief, who are storming the heavens with prayer, and storming the community with goodness and kindness and righteousness. That's our space. That's our work. So how do you fight like a Jew? We should all fight like the Jews. How do you fight like Israel? Would it be the case that the armies of the world fought with a morality and a courage that is the army of the Jewish people, the army of Israel? Because what was for us for so many generations is no longer for us in this generation. And I'll end then with a quote again, of course, from Churchill. As long as we have faith in our own cause and an inconquerable will, victory will not be denied us. Victory will not be denied us.